The Productivity Commission has released their draft report into financial services in Australia, and we discuss the findings. Hi, I'm Martin North, Principal of Digital Finance Analytics. The 600-plus page report was released today and contains an amazing array of observations and recommendations relating to financial services in Australia. The Productivity Commission has really pulled no punches, and in some ways this is what the previous financial system inquiry, the Murray inquiry, should have been. So I'm just going to go across some of the key findings and observations, because it really could change the face of financial services. It's worth saying, of course, that the draft report is now open for comment, and they may well change or modify their recommendations when it goes final later in the year. So from the top, the first critical observation is that effectively no one in Australia has been worrying about competition in financial services. What they say is that people like the RBA and APRA are fixated on financial stability. And the ACCC really has done hardly anything in financial services, simply because of the other regulatory bodies' involvements. So for years, essentially, we've had no one looking after the consumer from a competitive perspective. Their second observation is that to change that, either there is a need to create a new entity, a new organisation that has a particular mandate around competition in financial services, or potentially you could give that mandate to ASIC. But at the moment, it is sitting in no man's land. The second observation is that structurally we have a very concentrated industry with a small number of players controlling many facets of financial services. As a result of that, consumers are paying more than they should for their financial services products and services, and competition really is not very intense at all. That partly explains why the large financial services players in Australia are so profitable. It's not the excellence of their management, it's simply that competition is much less intense than in other markets. It also makes it much harder for smaller players to compete because they don't have a level playing field, thanks to the way that capital ratios vary between large players and small players. They made another observation about the fact that many consumers don't switch between different organisations. And they discuss whether this is simply because there is no reason to switch because the pricing is very similar, or whether it's too hard to switch because there isn't enough information available and the mechanisms involved in switching are so complex. They also made the point that neither mortgage brokers or financial advisors were acting in the true interests of their clients, partly because of commission structures and partly because of ownership structures. Another observation they made was that the Council of Financial Regulators, which is the mysterious body that comprises of the Reserve Bank, APRA, ASIC and the Treasury, the Council of Financial Regulators directs the strategic management of the financial system in Australia. And yet there is no public disclosure of any discussions, there are no minutes published. And of course it's an interesting tension between the independence of the Reserve Bank and the fact that Treasury is in that meeting too. So they suggest that at very least minutes of the meetings should be made available. They also make the point that the financial services playing field is stacked in favour of the very large financial services players in Australia and against smaller players and new incumbents. So there should be a mechanism to allow new players to come into the market and essentially compete. And they also suggest that the old four pillars policy, which was put in place some years ago to try and protect the four major players, is now getting in the way of competition and should be reviewed. So standing back, the report really drives a coach and horses through a whole bunch of the fundamental assumptions of the way that financial services works in Australia. It'll be very interesting to see whether these findings remain intact through the review and finalisation process. But my observation, having looked at the industry for many, many years, is that currently financial services in Australia does not do Australia proud. Essentially, we are paying too much, the margins are too high, it's too hard to switch, consumers aren't getting the right deals, the best deals, the good deals that they should be getting, and as a result of that, we are paying too much. So think of it as an additional tax on every person in Australia who uses a financial services organisation. And if we could drive greater efficiency out the back of that, create greater competition in the industry, we could make a huge difference to the competitive landscape in Australia. That could in turn translate into better propositions for small business owners as well as consumers. They also made the point that recent mortgage repricing and the bank tax has simply meant that people are paying more, and as a result, essentially banks are able to bolster their profits. So looking ahead, it'll be interesting to see how this translates into policy and how many of these observations and recommendations get translated into real actions. If they do, there is a significant opportunity to change the face of financial services in Australia for the better. If you found this useful, do like the post, leave a comment, and subscribe to receive future updates. I'm Martin North, Principal at Digital Finance Analytics. Thanks for taking the time to watch.